Welcome to our deep dive exploring happiness through the lens of evolutionary psychology.
Sounds fun.
We're diving into an interview with Dr. Bill von Hippel.
Oh, yeah. I saw that. From the Diary of a CEO, right?
Yes, he introduces this idea of the social paradox, which is super intriguing.
Yeah, what's that all about?
Well, he argues that our modern pursuit of autonomy might be undermining our happiness.
Interesting. We have more freedom and choices than ever, but still, so many people are unhappy.
Exactly. And like von Hippel suggests, maybe we've tipped the scales too far toward independence, overlooking our fundamental need for connection.
Yeah, like we're sacrificing those close bonds for the sake of, doing our own thing.
And he highlights this with some pretty striking stats. Like, get this, in the 1850s, only 1 in 100 Americans lived alone.
Wow. What about now?
Now it's a whopping 1 in 7.
Wow. That's a huge jump.
It is, right. And even couples who are together are spending less and less time with each other.
Huh. It really makes you think, doesn't it? Like, is all this freedom actually backfiring on us?
Right. And, von Hippel brings up this fascinating example of the Hadza tribe in Tanzania.
I think I've heard of them.
They live in these tight-knit communities and face tons of hardships, but they report being way happier than your average Westerner.
Really? It's
Yeah.
like those old sayings, right? Money can't buy happiness.
Yeah. And von Hippel points out this irony. City dwellers who tend to be wealthier report lower happiness levels compared to those in rural areas.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Cities can feel pretty isolating even though you're surrounded by people.
It is, right. And it's not just about being around people. Von Hippel suggests that it's the Hadza's social structure that's key. Their traditions of sharing, collaboration, constantly reinforcing those social bonds.
It's about active engagement, not just proximity, but the quality of interaction.
Exactly. It's like grabbing a quick coffee or chatting at work. It's not the same as really tapping into a sense of belonging.
It's like we're missing that depth in our connections.
Right. And this brings us to the Easterlin paradox, which von Hippel talks about. It basically says that while money increases happiness in the short term, overall societal happiness doesn't rise as a country gets richer.
That is a paradox. So more money doesn't equal a happier society.
It doesn't seem to, at least not in the long run. And von Hippel explains it through an evolutionary lens.
How so?
Well, for our ancestors, wealth was a sign of survival and success. The more you had, the better you could attract mates, provide for kids, and survive tough times.
So we're wired to chase wealth even though it doesn't actually guarantee lasting contentment?
It seems that way. But von Hippel does offer some practical advice.
Oh, like what?
He suggests spending money on experiences rather than material possessions.
Like travel or concerts,
Mm-hmm.
instead of, say, a fancy new phone.
Yeah, because experiences create those lasting memories and shared moments that strengthen our bonds. A new gadget might give you a temporary thrill, but it's those shared experiences that leave a lasting positive impact.
You're investing in connections and memories, not just stuff.
Exactly. Now, let's shift gears and talk about relationships and dating. This is where von Hippel dives into these fascinating, honest signals of quality.
Honest signals.
Yeah, they're like these subconscious cues we pick up on that signal a potential partner's desirability.
So it's more than just swiping right on a good-looking profile pic.
Way more. Von Hippel explains that men and women, evolutionarily, have been wired to look for different signals.
Like what? Give me some examples.
For men, it might be risk-taking behavior, ambition, or a sense of humor. Back in the day, a guy who took risks might be more likely to secure resources or protect his family.
Ah, that makes sense. Showing strength and capability. What about women?
For women, the signals might be more around physical attractiveness, youthfulness, and kindness. Those traits were associated with fertility and the ability to care for children.
Interesting. It's amazing how those ancient instincts are still kind of running the show.
It really is. But von Hippel also emphasizes that kindness and humor are universally attractive. They transcend the superficial stuff.
They point to the ability to form a strong bond. And that's attractive, regardless of gender.
Now let's talk about the elephant in the room. Dating apps and the rise of pornography. This is where the conversation gets a bit, complicated.
Uh-oh. How so?
Well, von Hippel points out this alarming trend. Sex among young singles is actually declining, while porn consumption is skyrocketing.
Whoa, really? You'd think it'd be the opposite with all this technology making it easier to.
You'd think so, right? But von Hippel thinks we might be falling into this trap of smiling, social media-induced laziness in our social habits.
Smiling. That's a mouthful.
It is, but it perfectly captures this idea that we're getting so used to instant gratification and online perfection
Hmm.
that we're losing the patience and resilience needed for real-life relationships.
Like we're trading the messy, unpredictable beauty of human connection for something that's, airbrushed and curated.
Exactly. And then there's porn. It often presents a very distorted view of sex and relationships, which can really mess with our expectations and desires.
Yeah, it's a complex issue, but one we need to address.
For sure. Now let's switch gears to the future of family. And guess what? Robots might be playing a bigger role than we think.
Robots. Taking care of kids, that's straight out of sci-fi.
I know, right? But von Hippel makes a pretty interesting case for it. First off, he points out that fertility rates in developed countries are dropping. Many are below the replacement level, which is 2.1 children per woman.
So not enough babies to keep the population stable. Why is
Yeah.
that happening?
Well, von Hippel suggests that maybe, evolutionarily, we didn't evolve to want kids, but rather to want sex.
So the drive to reproduce is hardwired, but the desire to nurture kicks in later, after the baby is born.
Right. And that disconnect between our evolved desires and the realities of modern parenting might be contributing to the hesitation some people have about having kids. I mean, it's a huge commitment, right?
Yeah.
Emotionally, financially, time-wise.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And let's face it, it's not the only path to a fulfilling life these days.
So, to address this, von Hippel proposes this, well, pretty radical solution, using technology, specifically robots, to lessen the drudge of parenthood.
Robot nannies. I'm not sure I'm ready for that.
It does sound futuristic, right? But he's not saying robots should replace parents. He's envisioning them as support systems, handling those repetitive tasks. Like, imagine robots changing diapers, preparing meals, maybe even tutoring the kids.
That would free up a lot of time and energy for parents to actually, connect with their kids.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot where technology enhances our lives without replacing those crucial human connections.
It's about redefining the role of technology in family life, finding that balance.
Now, with all this talk about the future of family, where does meaning fit in? How do we find meaning in a world that can feel chaotic and unpredictable?
Good question. Especially in light of everything we've discussed so far.
Well, von Hippel actually believes that life in and of itself doesn't have any inherent meaning.
Whoa, that's a pretty bold statement.
It is, but he doesn't see it as bleak. He finds it liberating. If there's no preordained meaning, then we have the power to create our own. We get to decide what matters and live accordingly.
I like that perspective. Taking ownership of your own meaning.
And what does he suggest we focus on? Connection and kindness, of course. He argues those things bring the most lasting fulfillment.
Those are recurring themes in his work, for sure. Building meaningful connections.
Right. He even talks about how being part of religious communities, even if you don't subscribe to the beliefs, can boost happiness. It's about that social support, that sense of belonging to a community.
Finding your tribe, so to speak.
Exactly. And he challenges us to find ways to create those supportive, tribe-like communities in secular settings, too.
Like through shared activities or common interests.
Yeah.
Finding that sense of belonging outside of a religious context.
Now, something else that's super relevant to all this talk about meaning and connection is von Hippel's observation about the declining rates of sex among young people. It's pretty counterintuitive, right?
You'd think with the internet and dating apps, we'd be having a sexual revolution.
Right. But the data suggests otherwise. And he points to smiling as a possible culprit. Remember that.
Social media-induced laziness.
Yeah.
It's sticking with me.
It's like we're so used to the instant gratification and curated perfection of the online world that we're losing the patience and resilience needed for real relationships.
And he's pretty concerned about the impact of porn, too.
He is. He shared some pretty shocking stats about how much porn consumption has increased, while actual sexual activity among young people has gone down.
It's like we're opting for the instant gratification and carefully scripted scenarios of porn instead of the, messy and unpredictable reality of actual intimacy.
Right, and it raises all these questions about how technology is shaping our expectations and desires and what it means for the future of relationships.
It's definitely a conversation we need to be having.
Now, one of the most thought-provoking parts of the interview for me was when von Hippel suggests that, evolutionarily speaking, we didn't actually evolve to want children.
We evolved to want.
Sex.
Ah, right, that makes sense. Our ancestors weren't exactly thinking about family planning and passing on their genes. They were driven by those basic urges.
Exactly. And of course, once a child was born, those nurturing instincts would kick in to ensure the survival of the offspring. But today, there's this disconnect between our evolved desires and the realities of modern parenting.
Yeah, parenthood is a huge commitment. A lot different from just the act of,
Right. And he thinks this disconnect might be part of the reason we're seeing declining birth rates in developed nations. I mean, it's a huge commitment emotionally, financially, and time-wise.
and it's not like it used to be, where having kids was the main path to a fulfilling life. People have many options now.
And this is where von Hippel's suggestion to leverage technology comes in. He's particularly enthusiastic about robots as potential caregivers, to ease the burden of parenthood.
Robot nannies, eh? Still wrapping my head around that one.
I know. It does sound a bit out there. But he's not suggesting replacing human caregivers altogether. It's more about robots as support systems, handling those repetitive tasks. Like imagine robots changing diapers, preparing meals, maybe even tutoring the kids.
It's definitely a different way to think about technology's role in family life.
The idea is to free up parents' time and energy so they can be more present and engaged with their kids, not to replace the human connection.
It's finding that balance.
Now, all this talk about robots and the future of family, it kind of makes you wonder about meaning, right? How do we find meaning in a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable?
Especially given everything we've just been discussing.
Right. Well, von Hippel is pretty upfront about his belief that life, in and of itself, doesn't actually have any inherent meaning.
Oh, that's a pretty heavy statement.
It is, but he actually finds it kind of liberating. The idea that if there's no set path, no preordained meaning, then we're free to create our own. We get to decide what matters and live accordingly.
It's a powerful perspective, taking ownership of your own meaning.
Exactly. And what does he suggest we focus on in this meaning-making endeavor? Connection and kindness, unsurprisingly. He argues that these are the things that lead to lasting fulfillment.
Makes sense. They've been recurring themes throughout our conversation.
He even talks about how being part of a religious community, even if you don't necessarily buy into the beliefs, can increase happiness. It's about that social support, that sense of belonging,
That sense of community and shared purpose, finding your tribe, like we talked about earlier.
Exactly. And he challenges us to find ways to create those same kind of supportive, tribe-like communities in secular settings too. Maybe through volunteering or shared activities.
Finding that sense of belonging and purpose outside of a religious context.
Now, something we haven't talked about yet that's super relevant to this meaning and connection stuff is von Hippel's observation about the decline in sex among young people. It's a bit counterintuitive, isn't it?
Yeah, with all this technology, you'd think.
Exactly. But the data shows otherwise. And remember, smiling. He suggests that might be part of the problem.
Social media-induced laziness. Yeah, it's a good one, that's for sure.
Right. And what about pornography? Von Hippel is quite concerned about its impact, too.
Yeah, he shared some pretty startling stats. Porn consumption way up. Actual sexual activity among young people way down.
It's almost like we're opting for the, instant gratification and carefully scripted scenarios of porn instead of, real intimacy.
It's a complex issue, for sure.
It is, and it raises a lot of questions about how we're shaping the future of relationships. Now, one of the most thought-provoking parts of the interview, I thought, was von Hippel's suggestion that we didn't evolve to want children, but rather to want.
To want.
Sex.
Ah, yes, that makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint. Our ancestors weren't thinking about passing on their genes. They were driven by those basic urges.
Exactly. And of course, once a child was born, the nurturing instincts would kick in to ensure the survival of the offspring. But, he argues, there's this disconnect now between those evolved desires and the reality of modern parenthood.
Yeah, parenthood is a lot more than just,
Right. And he thinks this disconnect might be part of why birth rates are declining in many developed countries. I mean, it's a huge commitment these days, emotionally, financially, time-wise.
And like we said before, it's not the only path to a fulfilling life these days. People have so many options.
And this is where von Hippel suggests we could leverage technology, like robots, to ease the burden of parenthood.
Robot nannies. Still get used to that idea.
Me too. But he's not talking about robots completely replacing parents. It's more about having them as support systems, imagine a robot changing diapers, preparing meals, maybe even tutoring the kids.
It's definitely a new way to think about technology in the home.
The idea is to free up parents so they can be more present and engaged with their kids, not to replace that human connection.
It's all about finding that balance, right?
Exactly. Now, with all this talk about robots and the future of family, it makes you wonder about meaning. You know, how do we find meaning in a world that can often feel chaotic and unpredictable?
Especially with all the things we've just talked about.
Right. Well, von Hippel is very upfront about his belief that life, in and of itself, doesn't have any inherent meaning.
That's a pretty bold statement.
It is. But he sees it as liberating. You know, if there's no set path, no preordained meaning, then we have the power to create our own. We get to decide what matters to us and live accordingly.
I can see how that could be empowering, taking ownership of your own meaning.
Exactly. And you know what he suggests we focus on? Connection and kindness, of course. He argues those are the things that bring true, lasting fulfillment.
Makes sense. Those have been recurring themes throughout our conversation.
They have. He even talks about how being part of a religious community, even if you don't necessarily subscribe to the beliefs, can boost happiness. It's about that social support, that sense of belonging.
Like finding your tribe.
Exactly. And he challenges us to find ways to create those same kinds of supportive, tribe-like communities in secular settings, too. Maybe through volunteering or shared activities.
Finding that sense of belonging and purpose outside of a religious context.
Right. Now, there's one more thing we haven't talked about that's really relevant to meaning and connection. Von Hippel's observations about the decline in sex among young people. It's counterintuitive, right?
Yeah, you'd think with the internet and dating apps.
Exactly, but the data shows otherwise. And he thinks smiling might be contributing to this trend. Remember, smiling.
Social media-induced laziness. Yeah, that one's hard to forget.
Right. What about pornography? He's pretty concerned about its impact, too.
He is. He shared some startling stats. Porn consumption way up. Sexual activity among young people way down.
It's almost like we're choosing the instant gratification and carefully scripted scenarios of porn over, actual intimacy.
It definitely raises some questions about the future of relationships.
For sure. Now, I thought one of the most thought-provoking parts of the interview was von Hippel's suggestion that, evolutionarily speaking, we didn't actually evolve to want children.
We evolved to want.
Sex.
Ah, that makes sense.
Our ancestors weren't exactly thinking about building a family. They were just driven by basic urges.
Right. And then, of course, once a child was born, those nurturing instincts would kick in. But today, he argues there's a disconnect between those evolved desires and what modern parenting is actually like.
Parenthood is a lot more than just,
Exactly. He thinks the disconnect might be part of why we're seeing declining birth rates in developed countries. Parenthood is a huge commitment, emotionally, financially, time-wise.
And like we were talking about before, it's not the only path to a fulfilling life these days.
Right. And so, to address this, von Hippel proposes that we could use technology to ease the burden of parenthood. He's particularly enthusiastic about the idea of robots as caregivers, to kind of take some of the pressure off.
Robot nannies. I'm still processing that one. I know. It sounds pretty futuristic. But he's not suggesting that robots would completely replace parents. It's more about using them as support systems. Imagine a robot changing diapers, preparing meals, or maybe even tutoring the kids.
It's definitely a different way to think about technology's role in family life.
The idea is to free up parents' time so they can be more present and engaged with their kids.
It's about finding that balance.
Now, all this talk about robots and the future of family, it makes you wonder about meaning. How do we find meaning in a world that can often feel chaotic and unpredictable?
Yeah, especially given all the things we've been discussing.
Von Hippel's very upfront about his own belief that life in and of itself doesn't actually have any inherent meaning.
Wow, that's a bold statement.
It is, but he sees it as liberating. Because if there's no set path, no preordained meaning, then we get to create our own. We decide what matters to us and live accordingly.
That's a powerful perspective, taking ownership of your own meaning.
And guess what he suggests we focus on in this meaning-making? Connection and kindness, of course. He thinks those are the things that bring true, lasting fulfillment.
Those have been recurring themes throughout our conversation.
They have, haven't they? He even talks about how being part of a religious community, even if you don't agree with the beliefs, can boost happiness. It's that social support, the sense of belonging to something larger than yourself.
Like finding your tribe.
Right. And he challenges us to create those same kinds of supportive communities in secular settings, too, maybe through volunteering or shared activities.
It's about finding that sense of belonging and purpose outside of a religious context.
Exactly. Now, there's one more thing we haven't talked about yet that's really relevant to this meaning and connection stuff. Von Hippel's observations about the decline in sex among young people. Kind of counterintuitive, right?
Yeah, you'd think with the internet and dating apps it would be.
Exactly. But the data suggests otherwise. And he points to smiling as a possible culprit. Remember that.
Social media-induced laziness. Yep, that one sticks with you.
It does. What about pornography? He's pretty concerned about its impact, too.
Definitely. He shared some pretty startling stats. Porn consumption way up. Actual sexual activity among young people way down.
It's almost like we're choosing the instant gratification and carefully scripted scenarios of porn over real intimacy.
It makes you wonder about the future of relationships, that's for sure.
It does. Now, I thought one of the most thought-provoking parts of the interview was when von Hippel said that from an evolutionary standpoint, we didn't actually evolve to want children.
We evolved to want.
Sex.
Ah, yes, that makes sense. Our ancestors weren't thinking about family planning. They were driven by basic urges.
Right. And of course, once a child was born, those nurturing instincts would kick in to ensure the survival of the offspring. But he argues there's a disconnect now between those evolved desires and the reality of modern parenting.
Yeah, parenthood's a lot more than just,
Right. And that disconnect might be part of the reason birth rates are declining in so many developed countries. Parenthood is a huge commitment these days, emotionally, financially, time-wise.
as we were saying before, it's not like it used to be, where having children was pretty much the only path to a fulfilling life. People have lots of options now.
Exactly. And that's where von Hippel brings up the idea of leveraging technology, like robots, to ease the burden of parenthood.
Robot nannies. That's what I'm still trying to wrap my head around.
I hear you. It does sound pretty futuristic. But he's not talking about robots replacing parents entirely. He's thinking of them more as support systems, Like, imagine robots changing diapers, preparing meals, maybe even tutoring the kids.
It's a whole new way of thinking about technology's role in the home.
The idea is to free up parents' time and energy so they can be more present and engaged with their kids. It's not about replacing that human connection.
It's all about finding that balance.
Exactly.
It's all of finding that balance.
Yeah. It is. And that leads to another point von Hippel makes about finding meaning, even if we accept that life itself doesn't have any inherent meaning.
You mean like, even if there's no grand plan?
Exactly. He doesn't think that means we're doomed to a life of despair,
I can see that. I mean, it'd be pretty depressing to think everything is just random and pointless.
He actually sees it as kind of empowering. Like, if there's no set path or predetermined purpose, then we get to create our own meaning, right?
I like that. Taking ownership, making your own meaning.
And what does he think is a good place to start with that meaning making? Focusing on things that bring joy and connection.
Unsurprisingly, connection's been a big theme in his work.
It has. He even talks about how being part of a religious community can boost happiness.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily about believing in all the doctrine.
It's more about the community aspect, the social support.
Right, that sense of belonging, of shared purpose.
And he challenges us to create those same kind of supportive communities in secular settings, too.
I love that challenge. It's like, we all need a tribe, right?
Yeah, a group of people who share our values and interests.
Maybe it's joining a book club or volunteering for a cause you're passionate about.
Or even just starting a regular get-together with friends who share your hobbies.
Now, something we haven't touched on yet, and I think it's relevant here, is von Hippel's discussion about the declining rates of sex among young people. It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It does. With dating apps and the internet making it easier than ever to,
Right. You'd think we'd be in the middle of a sexual revolution. But that's not what the data's showing.
And he put some of the blame on smiling.
Yes. Social media induced laziness in our social habits. A mouthful, but so true.
It really captures that feeling of getting sucked into the digital world, right?
Exactly. It's almost like we're trading that messy, unpredictable beauty of human connection for the airbrushed perfection of the internet.
He's pretty concerned about the impact of porn, too.
Oh, absolutely. He actually shares some startling statistics. Porn consumption is way up, and at the same time, sexual activity among young people is way down.
It's almost like we're becoming desensitized to real intimacy. Like we're opting for the instant gratification and the, carefully scripted scenarios of porn instead.
Right, and it really raises those questions about how technology is shaping our expectations and desires,
Yeah.
and what it means for the future of relationships.
Yeah, no easy answers there, but definitely a conversation worth having.
Definitely. Now, one of the things that really got me thinking was von Hippel's suggestion that, from an evolutionary perspective, we didn't actually evolve to want children.
We evolved to want.
sex. Which makes sense, right? I mean, our ancestors weren't thinking about family planning or passing on their genes. They were driven by those, primal urges to reproduce.
Right. And then, of course, once the baby arrived, those nurturing instincts would kick in, ensuring the survival of their offspring. But von Hippel argues that today there's this kind of disconnect between those evolved desires and what it actually means to be a parent in the modern world.
Right. And he thinks that might explain why birth rates are declining in so many developed countries. I mean, parenthood is a huge commitment, emotionally, financially, time-wise. It's not a decision to be taken lightly.
And it's not like it used to be. It's not the only way to live a meaningful life. People have choices now.
Exactly. And so this is where von Hippel's idea about leveraging technology to lessen the burden of parenthood comes in.
Ah, right. Those robot nannies. Still a little mind-blowing.
It's a pretty futuristic concept, but I think what he's getting at is using technology to handle those more, mundane tasks of parenting. Think about it. Robots, changing diapers, preparing meals, maybe even helping with homework.
It would certainly free up a lot of time and energy for parents to, actually connect with their kids.
Yeah. That's the idea. It's not about replacing the human connection, but about, finding ways to enhance it.
It's about finding that balance, right?
Right. And that leads us back to meaning, doesn't it? How do we find meaning in a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable?
Especially with everything we've been talking about.
Exactly. Now, von Hippel is very open about his personal belief that life itself doesn't have any inherent meaning.
Yeah, he doesn't sugarcoat it.
But he doesn't find that idea depressing. He sees it as liberating. Because if there's no set path, no grand plan, then we have the freedom to create our own meaning. We get to decide what matters to us.
That's a pretty powerful way to look at it. Taking control of your own life, your own meaning.
And what does he suggest we focus on in this meaning-making? No surprise here. Connection and kindness. He argues that these are the things that bring lasting fulfillment.
We've been talking about those all along, haven't we?
We have. And he even talks about how participating in religious communities, even if you don't necessarily agree with all the beliefs, can increase happiness. It's about finding that sense of belonging to something bigger than yourself.
It's about finding your tribe.
Yes, and he challenges us to create those same kinds of supportive, tribe-like communities in secular settings, too. Maybe through volunteering, shared activities, things like that.
It's finding that sense of belonging and shared purpose outside of religion.
Now, something else we haven't touched on that's really relevant to all this meaning and connection stuff is von Hippel's observations about declining rates of sex among young people.
It's a head-scratcher, isn't it? You'd think with dating apps and the internet it would be.
You'd think it would be a different story, but the data shows something else. And von Hippel suggests that smiling might be part of the problem. Social media induced laziness in our social habits.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Right. And what about the impact of porn? He's pretty concerned about that, too.
He is. He shared some pretty startling stats. Porn consumption is way up. Actual sexual activity among young people is down.
It's almost like we're choosing the instant gratification and carefully scripted scenarios of porn over the messiness and unpredictability of real-life intimacy.
It makes you wonder about the future of relationships, that's for sure.
It does. Now, I thought one of the most thought-provoking things von Hippel said was that from an evolutionary perspective, we didn't actually evolve to want children.
We evolved to want sex.
Yeah, makes sense. Our ancestors weren't exactly planning their families or thinking about, passing on their genes. They were just driven by those basic urges.
Exactly. And of
Right.
course, once a child was born, those nurturing instincts would kick in to ensure the survival of the offspring. But von Hippel argues there's a disconnect now between those evolved desires and what modern parenting is actually like, the commitment it takes.
Parenthood is a lot more than just, Right. And he thinks that might be a big reason why birth rates are declining in so many developed countries. It's a huge commitment. Emotionally, financially, and in terms of time, it's not a decision to be made lightly.
And like we were saying before, it's not the only path to a fulfilling life these days.
So von Hippel proposes we could use technology, like robots, to take some of the pressure off, to ease the burden of parenthood.
Robot nannies. I'm telling you, that one really threw me for a loop.
I know it does sound a bit crazy at first, But I don't think he's talking about robots completely replacing parents. It's more like, imagine a robot changing diapers or preparing meals.
Okay. Yeah, I could see that. Maybe even helping with homework.
Right. It frees up the parents' time and energy to focus on connecting with their kids.
It's all about that balance.
Exactly. So, we talked about a lot of interesting stuff. That whole idea of sexual plasticity in women really stood out to me.
Oh, yeah, me too. It's like we tend to think of attraction in these pretty rigid terms,
Right.
right?
Exactly. But what von Hippel's saying is that women might be wired to be attracted to a wider range of men.
Makes sense from an evolutionary perspective.
Hmm.
Back in the day, if a woman could secure support from, say, multiple partners, her chances of raising her kids successfully would increase.
Right. It's like a safety net, almost.
Exactly. And it makes the whole idea of attraction and mate selection a lot more complex than we usually think about it.
Speaking of those complex social dynamics, I was also fascinated by von Hippel's thoughts on city living.
Oh, yeah, that was interesting. Cities can be pretty isolating, despite being surrounded by people,
Exactly. And he pointed to this research showing that people in rural areas tend to report higher levels of happiness with their social lives.
even though they might have lower incomes, right?
Right. Which makes you wonder about the trade-offs.
It's like that old saying, it takes a village. In rural areas, you're more likely to have those close-knit connections.
But in cities, there's that sense of being surrounded by people but still feeling lonely. And von Hippel thinks that might be partly due to the individualistic mindset that cities kind of encourage.
Makes sense. You're constantly bombarded with stimuli, and you have less time and energy to really invest in relationships.
Right. It's like you're living in a bubble, even though there are millions of other bubbles all around you.
And that's where those little acts of justice that we were talking about can make a big difference.
You mean like those everyday gestures of kindness and fairness and just being a good person?
Exactly. Those small things can have a ripple effect,
Yep.
especially in an environment where it's easy to feel anonymous and disconnected.
A smile, a helping hand, a conversation. They can remind us that we're not alone.
Exactly. Now, something else that I found really interesting was von Hippel's observation about the role of religion in happiness. He was saying that it's not necessarily about the beliefs themselves, but more about the sense of community.
Right. It's like even if you don't buy into all the doctrines or dogmas,
You can still benefit from those regular gatherings, the shared rituals, the sense of belonging to a supportive group.
it's like a built-in social network. Gives you that sense of purpose and connection, especially in a world that can sometimes feel pretty chaotic.
And it kind of makes you wonder if we could replicate those benefits in a secular setting.
Right. Like, how do we create those kinds of supportive, community-based spaces outside of religion?
Food for thought, for sure.
Definitely. Well, I think this has been a really insightful deep dive.
Oh, absolutely. Von Hippel's work is always thought-provoking.
He really gets you thinking about those big questions. And I think his message ultimately comes down to this. We have more control over our happiness than we often realize.
It's about being mindful of our choices,
And cultivating those connections that bring us joy.
and finding that sweet spot between our own individual pursuits and our social bonds.
One last thought I'll leave our listeners with. Von Hippel talked about how dogs have evolved to be so in tune with human emotions. And he suggests that one of the reasons they bring us so much joy is because they give us this unconditional love and acceptance.
Oh, that's sweet.
So maybe it's not just about finding those human connections, but also opening ourselves up to the companionship and love that other species can offer.
It's about expanding our circle of compassion, I guess.
Exactly. And recognizing that we can find connection in the most unexpected places. Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep diving deep.